Well, I'm here to talk to you about the new Sony A6300. This is a new model release, and there's been a lot of fanfare about it. It is replacing the most popular model ever built. I was informed at WPPI at the beginning of this month that the A6000 had just overtaken another camera as the most popular camera model ever made. So Sony had a big job upgrading this camera and doing enough stuff to justify switching from the A6000 to the A6300. Now, the A6000 came out in April of 2014, so it's almost 2 years old, which is a long time for a model to hold the market. But it did a very good job. It's an excellent camera. When it came out, it was very far ahead of its time, and even still, it's superior to a lot of models in the category. So let's talk about the A6300. What has it done, and should you get one? It's a little larger, and it does help the ergonomics just a bit. It's a little easier to hold. It's got a little bit better grip. I don't know how well you can see that, but the grip is just a little bit larger. The camera's a little heavier, 404 grams versus 344 grams, so it's a little bit heavier, but not a lot, not significantly. Another thing is the processor has been updated. If you've watched me before, you've heard me talk about the three components that determine the quality of your image. And that is the processor, the image sensor, and the lens. Granted, there are other components that also influence the quality. Primarily, those are the three things. Now, the sensor is similar, but it's not the same, and I'll go into that in just a second. But the processor has been improved. There's more autofocus points. Sony made a big deal about how improved the autofocus is, the focus tracking is, and my experience has shown the focus tracking to be as good as anything I've ever used before, and very slightly better than the A6000. Of course, I like the A6000's focus tracking. I'm going to put up a couple examples. Now, what I did here is I went to a women's roller derby, and I took some quick photos as the action was coming towards me, and it did a very, very good job of getting what I wanted. It did stay on the faces. I have taken it to a couple other things. I took it to a silly little dog parade in one of the local towns for Easter. And what was curious is I was focusing, of course, on a dog, and the camera refocused on a part of the image that looked more like a face. And I kind of chuckled at that, and I thought, well, no, that almost makes sense. But be aware that if you're trying to take photographs of something besides a face, you may need to be aware of what your camera's trying to focus on. So I don't know whether that's a disadvantage of the system or the intelligent programming that it's putting in or what, but I presume that's what's happening. Now, let's go back to that sensor again. Now, Sony, if you don't know it, Sony is the leader in sensors right at the moment. Sony has done sensors for medium format cameras. They've done sensors for Nikon. They've done sensors in discussion for sensors for Panasonic, which kind of surprised me. They make excellent sensors, and their sensors are superior to almost anything else on the market. I would argue that Samsung actually heard their sensors for their newly discontinued cameras were very good, and they've been in discussions with Nikon, and we'll see how Nikon picks that up and takes it. But for the moment, Sony has the sensor market wrapped up. They invested a huge amount of money. Sensors are very good. So what Sony has done is they've replaced the makeup of the sensor with copper, and what's allowed them to do is make the sensor thinner and allowed them to make larger photodiodes. So this improves their ability to capture the light. And of course, light is what makes the photographs and what reduces noise in your images. So it's virtually the same size, but nonetheless, it is an improved sensor over the A6000. The next thing is this camera has a very strong support for the video shooter. It has 4K video without pixel binning. It's a very good sensor. However, I have heard of some heat issues. So I suspect that Sony has a fix close to market, because I don't think they would have brought it out knowing that they have an issue that they couldn't resolve. This camera is also capable of capturing 120 feet per second for slow motion, which is very nice if you want to do slow-mo. The next thing, now I really like this feature, is the silent mode. And this is one of the things that I really enjoyed about the Lumix GX series was their silent mode. I've used that during concerts and shows and found it to be very helpful because nobody could tell I was taking a picture. Now, the A6300 now has a silent mode, so that's a huge thing to people who shoot shows or things where they need to be quiet. A wedding, for example, where you need to be quiet. A6300 now has it. Now, the next thing is they have better A-mount support for those of you who have switched from the Sony A-mount. With the new phase detection system, the Sony A-mount focuses much faster. The question I have is, did Sony choose between 4K and in-body image stabilization? I suspect they needed the body size to dissipate the heat, and they elected not to try and cram the IBIS in. The other question that might be answered is, if they put in-body image stabilization in the 6300, would it steal sales from the A7 II model? And that's possible, and that is a consideration, obviously. So those are the primary features that I found of interest in the A6300. I do like the way it feels. I do like the way it shoots. I find myself primarily using it together with my A6000. I mount my Zeiss, Sony Zeiss 16-70 f4 on the A6300, and I put the 55-210 kit lens, the long lens, on the A6000, and they work very well together. I also have some other lenses in my kit, but this is the way I carry them around when I am out shooting. Okay, so let me do some comparisons now. In APS-C, the best competition, I think, is the Fujifilm. The Fujifilm does not have in-body image stabilization either. It's an older sensor. Even the newest of the Fujifilm bodies, technology is a little behind the Sony. As much as I like the controls on this camera, I love the controls. Everything's a dial wheel. It's very easy to work with, extremely easy. And the Fujifilm lenses are just excellent. I have no complaints about the Fujifilm lenses. Nonetheless, I have actually put this camera on the back burner. I'm not using this camera much anymore until Fuji can catch up with Sony on their sensors, their technology, their processors. The lens quality is just not enough to keep it up with the Sony. Sony is just forging ahead so quickly, it's putting the smaller camera manufacturers at a huge disadvantage. Now, Panasonic is a very large company also, and they have a lot of resources committed to their cameras. The one I have here is a Lumix Gx8, and as you can see, it is as large or larger than the Sony. Now, the Gx8 is also capable of shooting 4K. However, if you're going to be shooting video, the obvious choice is the GH4. The GH4 does not have any problems with overheating shooting 4K video. So for the moment, it has an advantage. However, you have to consider that the APS-C format shooting 4K video, 6K video without the pixel binning, but it's 4K. The GH4 has a larger body to dissipate the heat. So it has an advantage as far as heat dissipation. I'd like to see Sony resolve that problem quickly for those of you who shoot video. For the moment, my slight preference for video is going to be the GH4. When Sony gets the heat buildup problem resolved, I think it may be superior to the Lumix, only because of the phase detection system and their ability to track the subjects. That could be a huge advantage. We'll have to see. The Lumix also has some other advantages, but here again, Sony's trying so hard to become a player in the video industry, even in APS-C format, that I think that the Panasonic Lumix is going to meet a real challenge in that, the GH series. So they're going to have to do some work just to stay even with Sony if and when they get that heat problem resolved, the heat buildup. The next camera I'm going to compare this to is a little bit rough because this would be the Sony A7 Mark II. I've also got an R here. That's really not a good comparison because now we're talking about a much larger megapixel count and we're talking about a much more expensive camera. The A7 Mark II isn't that much more expensive, similar megapixel count, but it has in-body image stabilization. So if you are a still shooter, if you're shooting landscapes, if you want a full frame camera, it is a logical choice. It doesn't autofocus as well as the A6300 on moving subject. For sports photography, I would prefer the A6300. For landscapes, the A7 Mark II or the A7R Mark II. If you're doing landscapes, the Fujifilm is a good camera. But I still have to say the A6300 is much more versatile because if you have moving subjects, it's going to capture them a lot better than the Fujifilm. Not to mention the fact with the thin copper sensor and the larger photodiodes, the amount of noise present in the image should be much better. The A6300, they didn't call it an A7000, although they probably could have because they made substantial improvements to it. The Sony's compared to the Fuji, as much as I like Fuji, I simply can't recommend Fuji anymore in spite of the fact that I think their lenses are the best value on the market. Sony is coming out with enough new lenses for them to be in the game and to do a very good job. Panasonic, if you're looking for a smaller size, although the body on the Panasonic is larger than the body on the Sony A6000, the lenses aren't. You can get a very nice quality. What I have is a 12 to 35 f2.8. I also have a 35 to 100 f2.8 and a 7 to 14 f4. Very compact system, fits in a very small bag. The kit I use with the A6300, it was my A6000 go-to package, was the 10 to 18, the 16 to 70, and then I still use the 55 to 210. I have the big zoom for the Sony full frame. However, I do use the one for the APS-C, the 55 to 210, and I find it's completely satisfactory. Another thing I learned from Tony Northrup watching his videos is I have advocated for the large format full frame lenses on the APS-C because I thought using the center of the lens was better than using just an APS-C lens. And he takes issue with that and says that's really not true, that the lenses designed for the format are superior. So I'm going to back off on that absent any specific knowledge to the contrary. The lenses that I have for the APS-C format are smaller and I like them, and I can't see an improvement when I'm using the lenses from the full frame. So I am going to go ahead and say, go ahead and use your APS-C lenses if you intend to go to full format and you want to buy full format lenses. I'm not going to say they're going to degrade your image significantly, but apparently there is no need to do that unless you're intending to use full format. Let me wrap this up by saying the A6000 was a super camera. I always liked it. The A6300 is better by a degree depending upon how you use the camera. I really like it. I have no reservations about the price of the camera. I think it was a pretty good deal. By the time you view this, it may have gone down $100 to $200. I always try and get them when they're fresh out of the box, and I always pay their full initial retail. And very frequently in the next month or two, you'll see some price reductions. But even at the price I paid for it, $998, just less than $1,000, I think it was a very good deal, and I'm very happy with the camera. Is there anything I would recommend instead? Probably not. I think it is the best of what you can get at the moment in the APS-C format. If you want a full frame, get a full frame. Hardly recommend the Sony full frames. If you want a micro four thirds, the Gx8 is excellent. If you're a video shooter, The GH4 is even better. They have been reputed to be working with Sony on some new micro four thirds sensors, so I see improvements in that product line coming shortly. That's my take on all these cameras. I really like the 6300, I really do. I still use my Gx8 a lot. Full frames go with me whenever I'm on an important trip. Unfortunately, the Fuji doesn't go with me anymore, but I'd have to say Sony has a winner on their hands with the new A6300. I'm a real fan of the A6300. If you try it, I think you'll like it. Give it a shot. If you don't need the features that it has, if you don't shoot in low light, you don't need 4K, don't need a silent mode, don't shoot A-mount lenses, then the A6000 is still a very good camera and better than most of the rest of the stuff on the market. But for what I do, how I use it, I really think the A6300 is a winner. There you have it. Thanks.